started. Okay, welcome everybody to the History of the Reformation, Part 1. So this class comes about because when we did ancient Christianity, there were questions about what happens next. So the request was, can we learn about the Reformation and those crazy heretics of the 1500s? And so as I was preparing this class, and I started, working on Luther and telling the story of Luther, and I realized that so much of the story of the Reformation is in response to fill in the blank. And so it's really hard to tell the story of the Reformation without telling the story of what happened before it. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And I'll start my slideshow. Y'all see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So here's what we're going to talk about today. And this is, think about this as when you're creating a massive bonfire, this is all of the wood that is going into the bonfire that is going to go exploding in our next class. And you really can't tell the history of the Reformation without blowing through 1,000 years of the medieval times from Constantine to Luther. And that's what we're going to do, is try to blow through that quickly. Now, what I will say is that what I'm going to go over today, totally not in any way representative of what is a good history overview of the medieval ages. I'm just picking and choosing the logs that are going to go on that bonfire, the really significant kindling and logs that are going on there, okay? Because there's a lot. Now, if you remember where we left off in ancient Christianity, early Christians, we left off just as Constantine had come to power. So at that point in time, Christianity had expanded to be about 55, best guess, % of the Roman Empire. Best guess is Constantine made a pragmatic political decision and accepted Christianity. He wasn't baptized until he died, but he stopped making Christianity illegal, right? And he claimed the right to control the affairs of the church. So at that point in time, the church becomes answerable to the emperor. So that's 324 that happens, that Christianity starts to cross over from being that kind of ragtag collection to a structure of the hierarchy. Now, it did not become the official original religion of the Roman Empire for another 60 years. So it went back and forth over those 60 years until 380. And at that point in time, there's no turning back. It becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And some very specific things happen at that point in time. Think of these as the building blocks for your fire. The Christian clergy becomes a privileged class. They are exempt from a whole lot of laws. And remember, 100 years prior, they could have been persecuted, they could have been jailed, they could have been killed for what they believed, right? Clergy began to be seen as having a sacred character or calling set apart from the people. Big log that's coming in our fire. There was the erasure of the separation of church and state. So when Christianity became the official religion of the empire, it became the empire. And it began to look a lot like the Roman Empire. Patriarchal, so you saw no women in any of those leadership roles. Hierarchical, so you saw a very formalistic approach to leadership. Very legalistic, what's in, what's out, and deeply established power structures. All of that is going to blow up in 1,000 years. Okay, so very briefly, we know the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire does not last, right? So there's all these Germanic invasions over the next 150 years, coming down from the north, multiple invasions that's happening, right? And so it is a time of massive chaos. You're seeing the end of the Roman Empire here, right? So over the next couple of 100 years, Christianity is going to expand. Those really dark blue areas are the areas right before Constantine. And then you see what happens in the years 300 to 600. That is really basically Christianity becoming the Roman Empire, right? So that is the Roman Empire, and Christianity is superimposed on that map. And then you see that expansion of Christianity into that kind of pale green area, and that's going to happen 600 to 800. So Christianity is really spreading up, out, away from Rome. And during this time, the Pope is going to become a world leader. So we remember it was about end of second century, that it was really clear that the Bishop of Rome was the clear leader. As the Roman Empire is collapsing, the popes are centralizing their power. So the structure of the Roman Empire comes down. The structure of the Catholic Church is what remains. The church remains, not the Catholic Church. It's the only church now, right? Around the year 800, we have the emergence of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, in the course of his kind of world domination plan, becomes the first Holy Roman emperor. And at that point in time, Charlemagne creates the Holy Roman Empire. And he grants very official power to the Pope at that point in time. So again, you're seeing this linkage of the church and the state. When Charlemagne dies, however, that power is going to shift to the Pope, and the Pope is going to become the undisputed leader of the Holy Roman Empire. The church will take absolute power over the affairs of the empire. And you all know what happens when you take absolute power, right? Okay, so the Holy Roman Empire, it was basically a ragtag collection of regions and free cities in Central Europe that all came together under that rule of an emperor who was elected by the leaders of the area. So it was formed under Charlemagne. It continued for 1,000 years after Charlemagne. The Holy Roman Emperor claimed to be heirs of Charlemagne, even though they were elected. It was not highly centralized like a lot of the countries we see today. It was this ragtag collection, eventually hundreds of different principalities and municipalities coming together under that rubric of the Holy Roman Empire. And what's interesting is that the leaders of those municipalities and principalities, all those, did include bishops and abbots. So again, you're seeing this merger of church and state very, very, very tightly. So this is the scope of how big it was. This was around 1300. You're seeing the huge scope of the Holy Roman Empire. And imagine again, when you're seeing that yellow, that is consolidation of church and state, right? So the church became a state church under the Holy Roman Empire. So that means that it's liturgy. So the prayers that were said were for the empire and the emperor, the official prayers coming out of Rome, right? It's also was official church doctrine that the Holy Roman Emperor was the last of the world monarchies whose end would mark the inception of the kingdom of God. So they're tying theology, right, into state policy, right? Through the liturgy, the church's view of the empire as a vehicle of God's will for the Christianization of the world became prevalent. Again, The doctrine is being tied with global policies at this point in time, right? Okay, so throughout the Middle Ages, the people of Europe turned to the Pope as the leader of Christianity, the undisputed seat of the empire and of the church. At the height of papal power, only the Pope could lawfully dispose of that Holy Roman Emperor, and the Pope could not be judged and was only responsible to God. And there's a great story of how there was a Pope in the 1300s who didn't like the results of a German election, so they just overturned them and said it was null and void. That's the power that we have walking into this. Now, the Reformation is not the big schism, actually, at this point in time. The first big split was the schism that happens in 1054. And that's when the European Christian church is going to divide into the Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. So we're 1,000 years into the history of Christianity before this happens. Now, this divorce, this split between the East and the West, is 600 years in the making, right? So you've got the Pope in Rome, and then you've got the Patriarch of Constantinople. And for 600 years, they're fighting and they're going back and forth over doctrine and meanings behind words and all this stuff. And then the big split happens when the Pope excommunicates the Patriarch of Constantinople, right? So that's probably when you can say the divorce was final. So this is what the division looked like that when the schism happened. So you can see it's a pretty dramatic cut, right? Interestingly enough, Naples and Sicily go with the Eastern Orthodox. So why did it happen? A lot of people say it comes down to the Nicene Creed. In this language in the Nicene Creed, that the Holy Spirit proceeds not from the Father alone, but from the Father and the Son. Like Europe was divided over the interpretation of those words, right? So I just want you to kind of get the significance of how big this split was, because I think it is one of the kind of big kind of logs we're going to throw on the fire, right? So that there's this history of this big divorce in the background, right? And it's all over these two, the East and West churches split over an understanding of where the Holy Spirit comes from. Is it from God or from Jesus and God? Like,
wow.
Right. Okay. So, but it wasn't just that. As Christianity spread, you know, that papal power in Rome was consolidating, and they were kind of power mongering, right? And that didn't go over well with the Eastern churches. And there were lots of fights. There were fights over the liturgy. There were fights over what to do with church discipline. In the Eastern, they were proponents of married clergy. Celibacy of clergy was a big issue. Rules around fasting was a big issue. And so the divorce happens. 1054. 400 years later, we're going to talk about this. The Ottoman Empire is going to come in and take over a lot of this territory. Okay, so this is the first big divorce, and I'll do a little sidebar here. So this happened in 1054. There is some really wonderful work, historical work done about why celibacy and clergy had to be married. So for the first many hundred years, you saw clergy marrying. You saw clergy with children, and clergy were and weren't celibate. So, but as time proceeded, the church in Rome got stricter and stricter about both marrying clergy and celibacy. And there's some great research out there that ties those policy changes to battles over inheritance. So when priests were marrying and having children, then there became battles when they died over who inherited the property. And so as those escalated in number, the church became much more restrictive on clergy not marrying and celibacy. Causation versus correlation. That one's a hard one to turn away from, but so let's talk about the Ottoman Empire. Okay, this one's really, really critical because what happens in the medieval ages is, Islam begins in the 7th century in what we now know as Saudi Arabia and spreads rapidly. And the Ottoman Empire was a big factor in geopolitical politics in the medieval ages. In the 1400s, they're going to take over where Eastern Christianity resides, basically. And that fear of the Ottoman Empire spreading, you can look at the sheer scope of it. It created an enormous amount of fear in Europe. As a result of that, right, it pushed the rest of Europe to look elsewhere for trade routes, to look elsewhere for global trade opportunities. But there were really beautiful, good things that came out of this. These were centers, most of these were centers of learning and scientific development, mathematics, lots of different developments that came out of the Ottoman Empire. A lot of what we're going to see in terms of the church's reaction to the Catholic Church's reaction to the Reformation when they lash out will be in response to the Reformation. It will be also in response to a lot of Islamophobia that will be occurring. That's a big component of how we ended up with the Inquisition. Okay, so the role of religion in early Western Europe. So we've had the split, the divorces happen. We've got Eastern Europe, Eastern Christianity, we've got Western Christianity. We're just going to talk about Western Christianity from now on, because the split that is going to come is going to come within Western Christianity. So after the fall of Rome, for that 1,000 years, again, Rome falls, and what remains is that hierarchical, patriarchal, legalistic system of the Christian church. That is the organizing institution that remains. That impacted all of the politics, all of the interfaces between the nations, but it also, in fact, impacted everything at the village and family life. Everything revolved around the church. Sacraments revolved around the church, burial, baptism, birth, everything revolved around that church structure, right? So as Christianity spreads through Europe, if you think back to that map where it's growing up into Sweden and Europe, it is replacing pagan and animistic understandings, right? Sometimes it's co-opting them and taking them like the Christmas tree. Sometimes it's just renaming them. Sometimes it's just simply doing away with them. At this time, and some of this came from that prior pagan understandings, all events had a spiritual connotation. And this really became tied to a theology of sin for most of the Middle Ages. So sickness could be a sign that a person had sinned. And again, this understanding of sin, we know, comes from St. Augustine, this understanding that original sin, that all people carry that mark of original sin from Adam and Eve, a theology that came 300 years after Jesus, becomes the predominant theology within the Catholic Church around sin. So, so how to get free of sin becomes a huge issue. So in the church, again, there's only the church. In the church, if you could go to the priest who could absolve you of sin and give you what's known as penance, to atone for your acts. And if you did enough penance, then you could basically clear your file, right? So the priest held huge power over the lives of the parishioners, right? During all this time, the church was the seat of all knowledge. So Latin was the language of the church. Almost everybody was illiterate, and only the literate priests read and interpreted the Bible. And all that church theology, all matters of theology and doctrine were decided by the Pope. So when you think about the Middle Ages, this period leading up to the Reformation, think about control in all levels, the family, the personal, the community, all levels. The church had this really intense control. Okay, so the political power of the church. Not only did the church have this really tight control over the lives of everybody in Western Europe, but had incredible power in the politics of Europe at this point in time. So bishops were appointed by the Pope to rule in lots of different countries of Europe. Just think about that again. Bishops were appointed by the Pope to rule in countries in Europe, right? So, and the bishops took the orders from not a king, but from the Pope. One of the biggest sources of power that the Pope wielded is the power of excommunication. Which meant you were cut off from the Catholic Church and you were going to hell. So this was a pretty powerful statement. We're going to see in the Reformation, they're going to wield this a lot. So according to the Catholic Church, the Pope's power stemmed from God. He was appointed by God to make sure the Bible was followed. In reality, though, the Pope's authority came from the fact that he gave jobs to people. So when a new Pope comes into being, when the Pope dies, the new Pope is elected by basically his compatriots. During the medieval ages, the vast majority of those who were electing the next Pope were people who were in basically purchased seats in anticipation of that vote. Excuse me, as we're moving towards the Reformation and the Renaissance, the popes are going to start to lose some of their standing and authority. And this is going to come from some pretty awful actions that they're going to take. Their financial actions, sexual actions, fraudulent actions, and a lot of which is going to spark Martin Luther. Okay, right before the Reformation, here's what Europe looked like. During the Middle Ages, disease had decimated a lot of the large cities. So it had shrunk the population and it had concentrated wealth. And European societies used the feudal system to organize labor and power. So there were serfs who were within a feudal system, very, very hierarchical. You never got to expand out of that system. What you were born into was what you lived your entire life, right? It was very much a belief in private property rights. There was no communal understanding like we see in African or Native American societies at that time. Again, the Catholic Church was the foundational organizing institute. And then around 1340s is when the bubonic plague came to Europe. During the time frame, and it's pretty short, of about 100 years, about a third of Europe will die from the bubonic plague. So that's just a shocking number. So, and it's pretty significant going into what we know as the Reformation, right? After that time of just huge deaths, there was a time where there was just bountiful harvests, population exploded and grew. And as we're leading into 1940 and we're heading into the Reformation, there's kind of this rejuvenated European society. It's smaller, it's more prosperous, and that's what is going to launch into both the Renaissance and the Reformation. This is what Europe looks like as we're heading into the Reformation. So you've got Spain and Portugal. At this point in time, the Isabel and Ferdinand had taken back Spain from the Ottoman Empire. They will be Catholic stalwarts. The whole peninsula here will be. You've got the Holy Roman Empire in here. Poland, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire is still stretching pretty close into Europe, right? So this is what we have going into the Reformation. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Catholic Church before the Reformation. So, right, so everybody was a part of the Catholic Church. There were no other denominations in Western Europe. You were a part of that. That was your church, right? It was extremely rich and powerful. Again, nobody could read. So the Bible was told through the priests or through what's known as mystery plays, plays that would act out Bible stories. Masses were held in Latin, priest facing away. The service was not for the people who were attending, right? It was to give glory to God. Pilgrimages were a big part of the medieval European story, and people would take pilgrimages to pray for saints in their lives. And a lot of these places had relics, and we're going to talk about both of these. And then in 1506, Rome began the building of St. Peter's Basilica, a huge endeavor, a very costly endeavor. So now we're getting into the actual, and actually let me just stop there because we're going to talk now about how all those things contributed to what's about to happen. Any questions, anything we've done so far that I went over too quick? Okay, I'm going back then.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh,
You
yeah.
said that you said that there was only one church, the Catholic Church, but Judaism was a separate religion, right? And it did exist in Europe.
Yeah, so that's a painful story. So I'm only talking about Christianity, right?
Okay.
Okay, so right, so Jesus is born, and within 80 years, there's one tree, right? Christianity and Judaism. Within 80 years, they're going to start to do this. And within 300 years, there's going to be a little twig like this, and this will be Christianity, and this will be Judaism. When Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire, Judaism, which you remember in the 7th century CE, the temple was destroyed. The Jews were kicked out of Israel and Jerusalem. Massive deaths spread out across the world. The end of temple worship, the beginning of the rabbis in the synagogues. So there's this spread of the Jews into Europe after that happens. And you see Jewish communities popping up all throughout Europe. So there'll be big ones in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. And typically, the Jewish communities were confined to specific areas within the city gates. They were walled. The Jews could come and go at specific times. Depending on the location, the Jews had moderate freedoms to no freedoms. For most of the Middle Ages, it really, I would say, sucked to be a Jew in Europe. There was extensive anti-Jewish propaganda by the Catholic Church. During the Middle Ages is when you saw a lot of the passion plays that drew on the Gospel of Matthew, and where you hear the kill the Jews, kill the Jews. Those would be acted out during Holy Week. And what would happen in many circumstances is people would participate in these plays. They'd rile the crowd up so much that the crowd would then burst into the Jewish section of the city and just kill, rape, maim. And that was a standard part of Holy Week. And it was a pretty awful thing. In the, we didn't talk about it, but, during this time, the Crusades happened as well, right? So Jerusalem and the Holy Lands were subsumed in that Ottoman Empire. And there became this call to return that to Christianity. And so what the Pope did was offer basically, if you went as a soldier to fight in the Crusades, you were given a free pass for everything that you did, but you also were given a free pass for any prior sins that you had committed. So you got to wipe the slate clean on your prior actions, and anything you did while you were on crusade was also wiped free. As the first couple of crusades gathered and headed towards Jerusalem, through Europe, there are multiple examples of where they just tore through Jewish communities. And the first actions that the Crusaders took was to kill, rape, and maim those Jewish communities. There's some pretty atrocious stories of that. So we don't talk about, I didn't talk about the Crusades. I didn't talk about Judaism. Judaism is alive. And holding on, and in some places thriving, in all places, I'd say suffering extreme discrimination from Christian teachings and practices.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Bernie. Anybody else? Y'all good? I will say one of the best books I've ever read, Constantine's Sword. It is a historical account of the story of Judaism in Europe from the time of Christ all the way up to Auschwitz. And I think it's kind of a must read for all Christians. Okay, we're going back. Okay, when we talk about the fire, these are the big blocks. So what's going to happen next week, we're going to get into talking about Luther and his 95 Theses. Almost all of his theses are going to be him pissed off about what I'm about to tell you. First and foremost, the selling of indulgences. This is going to make Luther's head explode. It was the equivalent of saying you can buy your salvation, right? So you can purchase the forgiveness of sins, and you can buy forgiveness of sins, not just for yourself, but you can pay to get a loved one out of purgatory. And again, purgatory, you die in Catholic theology, you go into purgatory, and maybe you make it out afterwards, right? And there's no rhyme or rhythm as to how long you can be in purgatory. But in the Middle Ages, there was a money-making scheme by the Catholic Church that says, let's get people out, let's clear out the purgatory.
We lost your audio.
We can't hear you, Marci.
Maybe the Pope has struck her down.
I know. Can you hear me? That's pretty good, Bernie. I heard you. Okay, now can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to keep my video off and see if that helps. And you're right. What I am saying would have gotten me killed in 1400, right? Okay, but again, you gave some money and in return you got an indulgence. That's a really important word, right? Now, there was a very specific money-making scheme right around the end of the 1400s to get priests out there selling indulgences because they needed to raise money for St. Peter's Basilica, for the building of that, right? So a lot of these indulgences were sold all over Europe. Many were sold not far from Wittenberg, which is going to be a very important one, where Luther was a professor of theology. And this is going to be one of Luther's biggest concerns. Okay. The other thing is, and we're going to see this when we start to study the theology of the Reformation, a lot of what you're going to experience as theology that'll come out from the reformers are responses to things like relics. So relics came about, they started really with Constantine's mother, who went to the Holy Land and swore she found Christ's cross and all sorts of relics, right? And so what happened was, if a church had a relic, it very clearly translated to their bottom line. So if you had a relic, then you could bring it out at feast days, you could parade it around, people would take pilgrimages to your church. And so it was really critical for churches to have relics. Relics could be anything from Jesus's mother, from saints, right? And people would pay to see these relics. I took my oldest to Italy. If you've ever gone to Italy, it's impossible to not be exposed to the relics. They're everywhere in the churches in Italy. But we went to Siena, and we were in the cathedral in Siena, and there was this beautiful little alcove. And so we went over to the alcove, and there's all these people kneeling, and there's candles all around it. And my daughter looks over and she goes very loudly, "Oh my God, that is her head." And I was like, shh. So yes, you can still see Catherine of Siena's head at the cathedral in Siena. You can see these relics all throughout Italy. People paid a lot of money to go see them. And people paid a lot of money to do pilgrimages. And they would go to pilgrimages in Jerusalem, Canterbury, Lourdes, Rome, all over the place. A lot of the pilgrim routes that we still see today, started in the early medieval times by Christian mystics using pilgrimage as a way to come close to God. As we move closer to the Reformation, you see pilgrimages more taking on that financial component. That's going to really piss Luther off. There's also an enormous amount of papal corruption. It is just awful. I'm not saying you should watch the Borgias TV series, but it is very enlightening if you want to get a sense of what was going on. That's probably dramatized a bit, and some might argue not dramatized enough. So lots of internal power struggles. There was one point where the church had 3 popes at the same time. Again, it was a monetized system of getting people in power, favorite relatives, people who owed favors, and a lot of popes using the Vatican treasury to support very, very extravagant lifestyles. Popes and cardinals too, living more like kings than spiritual leaders. At this time, too, popes were commanding armies. The papal states had armies. They were making political alliances. They were making enemies. They were waging war. So lots of selling of church offices, lots of nepotism, lots of using the church treasury, the Vatican treasury as kind of a personal checking account. All of this, a layer on top of this is the emergence of the Renaissance. And this is really going to be one of the big logs that's going to lay on the fire, that's going to create the Reformation. So the Reformation, or the Renaissance, starts in Italy and is going to spread throughout Europe. It is the emergence of literature, arts, and science, and that study of the classics from Greek and Rome. It also saw the emergence of the humanists, and the humanists are going to put less emphasis on the church. So this is the first time, right, in 1500 years, and more on the individual. They're also going to be way more skeptical and questioning of the church as an institution. And people are going to be looking at the Bible and not the church for answers. That's going to be a cornerstone of the Reformation. When they're doing this, again, they're going back to the ancient texts in Greek and Rome, and they're looking for the original texts of the Bible, right? The Hebrew and Greek documents. And we remember, those of you that did the Bible class with me, what are they reading now? The Vulgate in Latin, right? So that's what is the official Bible through all this time, is the Vulgate in Latin. And we know that it had tons of transcription errors. It had tons of theology that was introduced by Jerome, who was an aficionado of Augustine. So the Renaissance is going to emerge right around the time we're going to see the emergence of the Reformation, and it's not a coincidence. In 1516, this was a year before Luther's going to write his theses, Erasmus is going to produce the first Greek New Testament in print. So remember the Vulgate rules, right? It's all about the Vulgate. But when Erasmus does this, it lets people read the Bible in a different manner, right? Erasmus's work is become the basis upon which Luther is going to translate the entire Bible. He's going to translate it into German. Tyndale's going to translate it into English. That's all coming. And then the final big log, big one, is the invention of the printing press. This is really important. The invention of the printing press is going to kick open the doors to disseminate learning. First book to be printed was the Bible. And the printing press is what's going to be responsible for rapidly spreading the ideas of the Reformation. Okay, here's the fire starters. We've got our fire. We've got the wood laid, the kindlings there laid, right? You got papal corruption. You've got the selling of indulgences. You've got the church maintaining this absolute control, right? You've got pilgrimages and relics, and then you throw on the printing press and the Renaissance, right? How are you going to start the fire? The big one here is John Wycliffe. Historians call him the morning star of the Reformation. Wycliffe lived about 200 years before the Reformation. And, you know, think back, this is a time of really extreme corruption. This was the time when they had 3 popes at one time fighting for control, right? At that time, the church owned roughly 1/3 of all the land in England, and which meant that all of that land was free from taxation, right? Wycliffe was an incredibly brilliant man, doctorate of theology from Oxford, but he was also a parish priest. And what Wycliffe did was he bucked tradition by taking on doing an English translation of the Vulgate. And if you remember back to that Bible class I just taught, boy, that was risky, really, really risky. The church had said adamantly, there is one Bible, it is the Vulgate, it is only in Latin. Wycliffe is going to go rogue and he's going to translate the Bible into English. Here's what Wycliffe believed. He believed the Bible was the ultimate religious authority for the believer. He believed that there's a direct relationship between humanity and God through Christ. He believed a person didn't need mediation of a priest to reach God. He believed that Christians could, if they stuck to the teachings of the Bible, govern themselves without the aid of popes or other spiritual leaders. He condemned the teachings about purgatory. He was violently, vehemently opposed to the selling of indulgences. And he repudiated something we're going to spend time on next week, the doctrine of transubstantiation. This is the belief in the Catholic Church that Christ is literally or spiritually present at the Lord's Supper, right? Transubstantiation, Christ is literally present in that Eucharist. And he believed that decrees from the Pope were infallible only when they were based in Scripture. And he held that Christ and not the Pope was the head of the church. If you look at this slide here, so this is 200 years before Luther's going to write his thesis. This is what Wycliffe is writing about and saying, right? This is the template that Luther's going to run with. This is the template that Calvin is going to run with. This is basically the playbook for the Reformation, right? So what happens to Wycliffe? They burn him at the stake, right? And then not only do they burn him at the stake, they still keep studying his work, declared him to be a heretic after he was dead, and decreed that his bones be dug up and burned. So the church came out swinging at kind of the first attempt to light the fire and put it out. They believed first by killing him and then by declaring him a heretic and digging up his bones and burning him, right? But Wycliffe, you know, the church may think they put out the fire, but they didn't. Wycliffe's embers are still there, kind of smoldering. And his work is going to set the stage for Luther, who's going to acknowledge Wycliffe's writings and teachings. And there will be a whole bunch of reformers over the next 150 years before Luther emerges, who are going to speak out like Wycliffe universally. They will all be persecuted and die when they speak out. So the Catholic Church, you're going to see these people trying over, you know, between Wycliffe and Luther, this period, you're going to see reformers trying to speak up, and the church will kill them universally, right? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing there and ask any questions. You know now what the logs are. You know that somebody tried to start the fire and the church thinks they put it out. They think that they have thrown so much water on this fire, it's never going to happen. Any sparks that come, they are going to grind them under their heels. That's what we're leading into with Luther. Any questions?
Well, most of this stuff, I have never heard any of this,
All right.
any of it. And
I'm
John
doing-
John Wycliffe, I've never heard that name, but as soon as it came up, I thought, oh, there's the first heretic. They're going to do something bad.
Yes.
And so they burn him at the stake, which burns the body. And then they dig his bones up and burn them again.
Yeah. Yeah.
These are, you know, anyway. It's
So I
fascinating.
want you to understand the context of fear and control, total control that Luther will be walking into as he starts to do his work. Total control. You speak up, it is death. And that's the first step.
There's a statue of another heretic in Prague. don't know his name, but he supposedly was early prior to Luther.
Yes, I'm blanking on his name, but you are correct.
Well, yeah, I don't know his name either.
Yeah, and there are going to be
And
several.
Huss or Hus?
Yes,
Yes, that's
Yes.
it. That's it.
there's going to be several leading up to Luther. Go ahead, Marilee.
When is the Inquisition and all this?
So we're going to talk a little bit about the Inquisition when we talk about basically how the Catholic Church is going to respond.
So it's
Um,
after the Reformation?
It's simultaneous.
Oh,
Because what's going to happen is the Reformation is going to explode, right? And then in areas that are very, very well controlled by the Catholic Church, like Spain, like Italy, you're going to see the Inquisition being used as a tool to maintain that control, but also to do things like deal with heretics, like Jews who will not convert, or Islamics who will not convert.
Kill them,
Kill them.
kill them.
Yeah.
Good Christian way of thinking.
Right.
It's amazing that the Catholic Church gave up the Mass being in Latin in 1962.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1962. Up until that point, it was exactly the way it had been. Priests back to the audience and all in Latin.
Yeah. So
And
here's
they
my
did away with
question.
purgatory.
Yeah, we have a few minutes left. So now you've kind of heard where we're going next week as we dive into Luther. This is the context. This is the background. This is the stack of wood, right? The Catholic Church thinks it's doused in water. It is not. It is brittle. It is dry. It is ready to burn. They just are basically pretending it isn't. So here's the question. Now that you've kind of heard the story of the Catholic Church in the medieval times, it controlled all aspects of a person's life. So the question would be is, how do you imagine this control helped the church to grow? And how did that control keep the church from evolving? So I was going to break us into groups, but I'm just going to open it up for discussion. Thoughts on how it helped it control, how it helped it grow, and how it kept it from evolving. Go ahead, Liz.
Well, I imagine because of the fact that there was not any kind of real universal education and much of the population was illiterate, especially before the printing press, it was easier to keep control because people didn't have anything different to believe or understand about it.
Yeah, that's great.
You know, something I've learned over the years is this issue of control. When you control somebody's spiritual life and you control their sexual life, you're really controlling them. That's just one aspect. And there was a lot of fear-based stuff that's being taught.
Yeah. Marilee?
I lost it.
Anyone else? Go
Well,
ahead.
when I think of, my childhood in the 50s being brought up in the Catholic Church, I'm telling you, not as extreme, but a lot of that stuff was there. And like you said, it was the fear. The Pope was this, the priest, you had to go to confession and the priest would absolve you. They didn't get money, but you got your 10 Hail Marys and I was so afraid of purgatory and all of those things. It was that intimidation and that kept you never, like I said, I never studied anything else. It was that same stuff that you've talked about how many hundreds of years ago before that was still taught all through the 50s and not being able to ever read anything else or hear anything else. Never.
Yeah.
One of the aspects that's always, it's so obvious to me is how much money and riches went into the church during this time. And every time I travel to Europe and you end up going to all these cathedrals, I know they're beautiful, but it's also just so depressing to go into these cathedrals and see all the money that's been put into that building, which
Yeah.
could have been helping people. No wonder the Middle Ages was so dark. The people were not treated well at all. They were just disposable. But the buildings.
Yeah, yeah. So,
I think
go ahead, Bernie.
very quickly, I think another reason why the Catholic Church was so powerful back in this period, the Middle Ages, and so there wasn't anything else. There was no television, there were no mariners, there were no, I mean, what was people to do? They had religion. They couldn't read, as somebody already pointed out. And there really wasn't, nobody played bridge. I mean, there wasn't anything to do except religion. So that's where you put your time
Yeah, and your money.
and your money.
Yeah. I read a book called Hild, H-I-L-D, and it's about Christianity coming into England.
Yeah,
And there were the traditions of the older religions, and those didn't just go away. They kind of went into the background, and some of the priests of the old religion became Catholic priests, but they were actually more humane than the Catholic priests that came from Rome. You know, they talk in the book all about that. Well, that's a Roman priest, or that's a, you know, a native priest. You know, so that part was still there, and I think that was what a lot of people held on to for a very long time.
yeah,
Even though they were officially this because their king or whatever was officially this, and he had all the power. So
yeah. It's a great book. I love that book. Okay, here's what happens next. This is part 1. Part 2. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Renaissance, but we're going to really move into Luther. And Luther's story is really, really important. And then we're going to talk about how it spreads from Luther into Switzerland, which is, for those of us in the UCC, the bones of our denomination are going to come out of Switzerland. And then we're going to talk about basically some of the really tragic repercussions that come out of the Reformation. That's part 2. We're really going to get a handle on the theology and the story of first Luther and then Calvin. Those are the big ones we're going to spend time on next week. And you're going to say, when we go through what they believe, you're going to track it back to Wycliffe, that slide I showed you, and say, yeah, there it is. That's the bones. That's the playbook of the Reformation. So that's what we're going to go through next week. Okay. The third week, we're going to go to England and talk about how Anglicanism formed the King James Bible, and then how Christianity spread out of there and how we still see the Reformation unfolding today. Okay. So that's the plan. 2 more sessions. Okay, everyone?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was